Uhuru, Uhuru Sasa, which means freedom now in Key Swahili. We just completed the Jazz Zone with TN Providence, and we just had a great interview with Rupert Charles Lewis of the great Garvey historian and the great Walter Rodney historian. And joining us on the line is Professor Dr. Comrade Gerald Horne. And what's new, my brother?
Hey, it's all good.
You're listening to Dr. Horne, and what is the title of your latest volume, and how is it doing review wise? And where have you got reviews from and interviews from?
When interviews. I did one on WBAI, the Pacifica station in New York, just a few days ago, and you can find the broadcast on YouTube at the Activist News Network. And likewise, I did an interview with the De Facto podcast, and you can find that also on YouTube, and you can also find it on the Activist News Network. The title of the book is Slavery, the Slave Trade, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, North Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, West Asia, Ottoman Turkey, Western Europe, and Russia. Obviously, the subtitle says it all in terms of the geographic and historical breadth, and the words preceding the subtitle helps to direct the potential reader to the point that this is a book that has U.S. imperialism in the crosshairs.
Mm-hmm. U.S. imperialism is, I think your thesis that U.S. imperialism is on the decline.
Well, certainly. You can see that clearly with regard to this quagmire in Iran, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But perhaps we should begin with this trade war with Canada. It's very serious, particularly if you look at some of the sticking points with regard to why the negotiations broke down. One of the sticking points was that Washington was demanding that Ottawa not enter into certain trade agreements with nations which the United States disagreed with. In other words, that was a clear attack on Canadian sovereignty. And it's consistent with Mr. Trump's demand of 2025 that Canada should become the 51st state. That is to say, you first clip the wings of Canadian sovereignty, and then that facilitates the annexation of Canada. This is going to be a real test for Canada, and I trust that Canada will be up to the task. What I mean by that is we already have in motion the attempt of Alberta, the oil-rich prairie province, to secede from Canada. My understanding is that if that vote were held today, that it would not prevail. But it should be concerning that the State Department has been meeting with the secessionists, which is a clear interference in the internal affairs
Of Canada.
of a sovereign state. And then I think there should be some self-criticism amongst all sectors in Canada, starting with those who rule Canada, who allowed their economy to be virtually integrated with the economy of the United States, which means that as a result of these excessive tariffs placed upon Canadian exports into the United States, there's a possibility that certain Canadian firms will relocate across the border to the United States. Obviously, these are not patriotic capitalists we're talking about. And there's a possibility that tens of thousands of Canadian jobs will be lost. Now, obviously, the Canadian ruling class did not take seriously the process, the historical process in terms of how the United States came into being. That is to say, I guess they assumed that when the United States was annexing the Hawaii Kingdom, for example, or the jurisdictions of Native American groupings, I guess they thought that they would get a pass, perhaps because they're defined as, quote, white, unquote. I'm not sure what they were thinking, but certainly it was naive in retrospect. And as I've been saying a number of times, I don't think that the left in Canada should be left off the hook. Now, whenever I make a statement suggesting that the left has not done a sufficient critique of republicanism in the United States of America, they changed the conversation to how they were critical of the US war in Vietnam or critical of the overthrow of Grenada. I mean, that's all well and good, but I said republicanism. I didn't say US foreign policy. That is to say, how this country came into being post 1776 with a revolt against British rule that led to the increase of the number of enslaved Africans, many of whom fled to Canada. So that should be no excuse with regard to that. That is to say, the enslaved Africans fleeing north of the border, as we all know, and the disintegration and liquidation of Native American polities, for example. That is how republicanism came into being. And what's interesting is that many in the Canadian left, like the left elsewhere, they have this stinging critique of socialism. They say socialism might be a good idea, but the way it came into being, I'm not down with that. Well, why don't they say that about republicanism? They might say republicanism is a good idea, but the way it came into being in North America was horrendous. It was genocidal. And that is one of the many reasons why Canada is facing this crisis. That is to say, all sectors virtually did not take history seriously. And what's interesting is that all they had to do is pay attention to the critique of republicanism and of how the United States came into being, not least from the Black community of the United States of America. But for whatever reason, our critiques have not been taken seriously. And now Canadian sovereignty is up for grabs. It's a very serious crisis. However, on the other hand, I think that one upshot of this crisis will be this, and I'd like to hear your opinion. That is to say, I fully expect France and Quebec to become closer as a result of this crisis. I expect France to not be somnolent as US imperialism seeks to annex the territory north of the border. Recall that when Mr. Trump started talking about annexing Greenland, that Mr. Macron, the president, began flying to Greenland, for example. So that is going to be something that is going to have to be contemplated. But once again, I'd like to hear what our Canadian friends have to say about this.
Well, in terms of oh, go ahead, Melinda.
No, my thing is the reason why the reason why that is because of the settler sort of colonialism solidarity. The reason why there's no critique is because here on this side we have a settler colonial nation, and if they're going to question US's settler mythology, we would have to critique ours. So that's my input. The reason why that hasn't been a thing on certain, factions on the left.
And Gerald, I think that, Islam and republicanism, according to their history, republicanism came in the same way as Islam. They claim Islam came in, with through violent means, but the same thing you're saying about republicanism, one. And we must remember that the South Africans studied Canada, the whole apartheid situation. Some of the lessons of apartheid were learned from the First Nations people of Canada, how the great liberal Canadians treated the First Nations, or the Indians, so-called Indians in North America. A lot of that came, the Boers learned that from the Great White North.
And just another footnote, I recall when I was living in British Columbia last year, and parenthetically, I should mention that my book, based upon my research in 2025, will be my first book of 2027, The Counter-Revolution of 1858, the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, Slavery and Indigenous Dispossession. Make a note. But I recall when I was living in Victoria, British Columbia last year, and when Mr. Trump first started making noises about annexing Canada, that voila, ooh la la, all of a sudden French nuclear submarines began to show up off the coast of Nova Scotia, for example. So I think just like with the Iranian crisis, Mr. Trump is in way over his head. He hasn't thought things through, but at the same time, I'm nervous about the ability of Canada to resist this power play by US imperialism. And what's remarkable is that seeking to blunt what it seemed to me was inevitably going to happen, that is to say, the attempt to take over Canada, it seemed that it only began to be taken seriously when Mr. Trump started making these noises. Now, in my book, for example, which will be out, as I said, in a few months, I talk about what happens as Canada or Canadian Confederation is coming together in the aftermath of the US Civil War, post-1865. And at the same time, the United States, which had moved to liquidate the indigenous in the Pacific Northwest, the states of Oregon, Northern California, the state of Washington. It's always difficult to say, but it's one of the most bloodiest genocides in the history of North America. Although there's so much competition, it's difficult to say that that's actually accurate. So after they seized Northern California, Oregon, and British Columbia, then Russia made one of the most boneheaded decisions in the history of Russian diplomacy by selling its claims to Alaska. The United States takes over Alaska 1867. And then what that means is that Washington had British Columbia and the Yukon in a pincers, pushing down from Alaska to the north and Seattle and Portland from the south. And there was a clear ambition to take over British Columbia. Sometimes I wonder, I mean, do these people north of the border, are they aware of this history? Do they take history seriously? Or should we bow to the wisdom of Melinda and suggest that their settler colonial consciousness hampers their ability to understand settler colonialism and its aggressiveness in the United States of America?
Well, let me say that the Canadians seem to be having consolidated. I mean, it's so many. The provinces don't seem to be as I guess the ruling classes are as united as the so-called United States of America. You know, in terms of, you got the southern part of the United States, they seem to be in alliance. You know, the north, the certain sectors, or it seems to be regional unity in the United States, where it's not as much regional unity in Canada. That's my assessment in terms of, you know, you got Alberta is not really united with not Ottawa, Ontario, because I think that, Ontario seems to get all the resources, and there is a fair bit of jealousy, which is correct jealousy. When I shouldn't use the word jealousy, but Ontario gets all the resources and the other provinces are sort of neglected. Would you say that's true, Melinda?
Yeah, in a way, but it's also the historical, certain provinces didn't join, the federation.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the East Coast, they didn't join till
Later.
later on. So it's different history, I would say. So like the unity is more sporadic in Canada. Yeah,
Well, I
it's
should
a
also
little bit
say,
more nuanced, I would say.
oh, sorry for that interruption, but I think the United States economy is going to suffer also as a result of this trade war. Already, you see that the U.S. liquor industry is really suffering. California wine, for example, from the Napa Valley, is being boycotted in Canada. The hard liquor from Kentucky, Jack Daniels, is being boycotted. As a matter of fact, Jack Daniels might have to go bankrupt, which I'm sure is going to displease many of my alcoholic friends, for example.
Jack Daniel. Oh yes, 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 yes. I think my pops was a was not that he was an alcoholic, but he was a Jack Daniels man, right? I didn't mean to cut you, Gerald.
Well, I guess we're going to have to keep a close eye on that, but I guess we should go to the major crisis and quagmire of this Trump soap opera, which is this failing war in Iran. Now, what's happening now is that in many ways, Mr. Trump has run up the white flag, but he's done it once again in a unique fashion. That is to say, it's like the moonwalk. He's retreating, but he's trying to make you think that he's advancing. What I mean by that is he's announced that there are going to be these eye-watering, bone-crushing economic sanctions on Iran. Now, those kinds of sanctions have been placed on Russia, Zimbabwe, Cuba, etc. And the last time I looked, those regimes are still intact. So we'll see what happens. But I think it's basically an acknowledgement that the military option has failed. And then, in order for these bone-crushing, eye-watering sanctions to be effective, then China, which buys 90% of Iranians' oil, the major earner of foreign exchange, they're going to have to be sanctioned. Now, you recall what happened in 2025 with these bone-crushing, eye-watering tariffs of April 2025 on Liberation Day. In Busan, South Korea, in November 2025, Mr. Trump retreated from putting those sanctions on China because China began to curtail the amount of critical minerals that they would export across the Pacific, which are necessary for U.S. military materiel, necessary for automobiles, etc. And so, interestingly, in the New York Times, a Chinese spokesperson said, basically, you can't take this Trump guy seriously. There's a credibility discount, was the phrase that he used. In other words, how many times has he threatened to destroy Iranian civilization and bomb them back to the Stone Age, particularly as the markets are closing on Friday, and then as they're resuming on Monday, he talks about peace proposals, for example. I mean, this guy's just manipulating the market. But once again, I think that we should stress what is conspicuously and sorely missing in the US discourse, particularly in the left discourse, which does not tend to acknowledge that Mr. Trump got 77 million votes in November 2024. He still has a substantial base of support, a base of support that's being augmented by his handing out pardons and failures to prosecute like candy to the insurrectionists of January 6, 2021. So in other words, he's developing a kind of private army that's going to have a mass base. And as long as Mr. Trump moves aggressively against diversity, equity, and inclusion, moves aggressively against universities that have seemingly promoted same, his base will be content because they think that that gives them a leg up in terms of the job market. Now, that is a basic reality of US politics that once again is sorely and conspicuously missing. These folks on the left, they tend to think that the Trump base, they're all sort of misunderstood social democrats. All you have to do is promise them Medicare for all and they'll come running. Well, you would have to promise them Medicare for settler descendants. Then they might come running. It's just like I say in the aforementioned book. If you analogize the settler colonialism in historic Palestine to that in North America, David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, when he alighted in historic Palestine decades before the founding of Israel in 1947-48, one of his initial proposals was that Jewish entrepreneurs should only hire Jewish workers. Now, these propagandists here in the United States, particularly the Zionist propagandists, they try to tell us that Ben-Gurion was some sort of socialist. That's the strangest kind of socialism I've ever seen in my life. And likewise, the settlers here, they resonate to the idea that proposals like the Homestead Act, where land was taken away from the Native Americans and then doled out to the settlers with the creation of these land grant universities, such as those in the Midwest, University of Minnesota, University of Michigan, Ohio State, etc., where only settler descendants for decades were allowed to matriculate, and even the faculty has hardly been desegregated since the bad old days of the late 19th century. So we began by criticizing some of our friends in Canada for their inability and perhaps unwillingness to do an analysis of their homeland. But even with the kinds of omissions in Canada, they pale in comparison to the critique that you can make of the US left, for example.
Could you talk about the whole situation of I guess you have what is Taco Tuesdays, and you always talk about Mr. President Trump as being, I guess he's the master of the taco. Could you talk about that?
Well, Trump always chickens out. I mean, it's a reflection of the fact that, as they used to say in the streets, Mr. Trump sells a lot of wolf tickets. I mean, he's always has to appear to be aggressive and on the offensive. But when a bully is confronted with a similar sort of aggressiveness, what happens is Mr. Trump tends to fold like a cheap suit. That leads to Taco. Trump always chickens out. He backs down, like he backed down, as said, with regard to these tariffs on China, for example. So this is the state of play. But fortunately, there are other developments globally that we probably should at least address glancingly before our time expires.
We have 9 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, and one is that we've been talking about how Paul Biya, the 93-year-old leader of Cameroon, has been in Switzerland since June 7th. Well, he decided to come home this weekend. He must have been tuning in to Diasporic music and heard the criticism. But his problems have not gone away. The secessionist movement in the so-called Anglophone territory of predominantly French-speaking Cameroon, not to mention the instability creeping across the border from neighboring Central African Republic. With regard to Zambia, the Southern African cotton-producing nation, President Hichilema supposedly won, but apparently he stuffed the ballot boxes. And so we expect a certain amount of instability going forward in Zambia. And excuse this nervous tick, but I must return to US imperialism the major cancer in terms of global politics, because I'm afraid to say that this economy is heading for an iceberg, and that's something that the Canadians need to factor into the equation as well. What I mean is debt hit $40 trillion just this past week. The United States is having to pay more in terms of getting banks like the People's Bank of Beijing to buy their commercial paper. That is to say, to make loans to the US Treasury. China's asking for higher interest rates. Japan is asking for higher interest rates. This has knock-on effects in terms of housing costs, mortgage costs, car loans, etc. And then there's the artificial intelligence bubble. Oracle, Apple, Microsoft, not Apple necessarily, but Oracle, Google, NVIDIA, a multi-trillion-dollar corporation in the Silicon Valley, they are also borrowing heavily in order to inflate this artificial intelligence bubble. The problem is that China is not far behind, if not already ahead. And so with this competition for scarce capital, a question that we need to pose is the United States headed for an economic crisis like 2007, 2008, or is it headed for a crisis like the big enchilada of the 1930s? If it's the latter, well, then our friends in Canada are going to have to contemplate what that may mean for their economy. Although, to be fair, Canada is better positioned to weather such a crisis in light of some of the social democratic measures that have been implemented in recent years. Whereas in the United States of America, what you can fairly come to expect is not only higher unemployment rates, higher levels of homelessness, but, and here's the depressing crisis, higher rates of suicide.
You're listening, Gerald. Are you still there?
I'm still here.
Oh, you went off. It was silent for a second.
I'm throwing the microphone back to Canada.
Oh, I have a question for you. We were talking about Zambia. I'm having a senior moment. There was a brother from the United States and Canada who was working with Nkrumah when Nkrumah was overthrown. They went to Zambia. I can't recall his name. You talk
You're
about him a lot.
speaking of W. Alpheus Hunton,
Exactly.
who is now going to be the subject of a biography by one of our leading historians, Eric McDuffie of the University of Illinois. You may be familiar with his most recent book on Garvey and Garveyism from Duke University Press, his book on left radical Black women in the 1950s, also from Duke Press. Now he's tackling W. Alpheus Hunton, an academic formerly with Howard University, leaves Howard University, works alongside Du Bois and Robeson and the Council on African Affairs until it's driven out of business. The Council on African Affairs is a premier anti-apartheid organization driven out of business by US imperialism in the mid-1950s, and then a few years later, moving with Du Bois to Ghana, working on the Encyclopedia Africana after Nkrumah is overthrown in 1966. He moves temporarily to Guinea-Conakry and then to Zambia, where he is buried.
Wouldn't you say that Zambia, in terms of Kenneth Kaunda, does not get enough credit for the role that he played in the liberation of Africa and Pan-Africanism?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. But that's par for the course, I'm afraid to say.
Melinda, do you have any other questions?
Well, we're kind of running out of time. Where do we want to go next in the list? Do we want to touch on the U.S. deportations?
Oh, yeah, this is very serious. First of all, As a matter of fact, there's something you all need to watch out for, is that thousands of Haitians are about to be ousted from the United States of America. Many of them will try to reach Quebec. And we understand that the United States, once again, is cooperating with the Canadian authorities and turning them back. So obviously, our Haitian brothers and sisters need a kind of trans-border solidarity. I should also say that Liberia in West Africa has agreed to accept 1,300 deportees from the United States of America. Likewise, they are joining Eswatini, the former Swaziland, Rwanda, South Sudan, all of whom have chosen to accept deportees, not just Haitian deportees, but deportees in general. This is the kind of measure that thrills the hearts of the Trump base when you oust Haitians, when you oust Black people. But once again, it's difficult for many of our friends on the left to accept that cruel reality, because they tend to flock towards these naive notions of what the solidarity looks like.
And with that, I think we will definitely be back in contact with you next Sunday, sir.
All right, good luck to you.
All right, and I would like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us, as Rick James would say, on the one. And Melinda, you have any parting thoughts?
Yeah, hopefully our listeners stay safe throughout the week, and we will see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.